I Hate the News is the weekly news bulletin from I Hate Politics podcast, a show about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. It's July 1st, 2025. The Tuesday I Hate the News episodes are usually short segments of news other outlets miss or cover inadequately. But last week, the Supreme Court delivered 5 rulings. We will take on 2: the ban on universal injunctions and giving religious parents the option to opt out of public school instruction when they disagree. We also look at the Trump administration's extraordinary lawsuit against all 16 judges on the Federal District Court of Maryland. And we draw lessons for ranked choice voting from Zohran Mamdani's victory in the New York City mayoral primary. Turns out one person possesses the very particular set of expertise across the Supreme Court, electoral systems, and New York. Walter Olson is a longtime legal scholar, previously at the conservative Manhattan Institute, and now for several years at the libertarian Cato Institute, and a longtime supporter of ranked choice voting. He's also deeply embedded in local and state politics, especially in Frederick County, Maryland, where he lives, and has served as co-chair of a bipartisan Citizens Redistricting Commission appointed by former Governor Larry Hogan in 2021. With one guest, this may seem like a Friday I Hate Politics feature interview, but let's see if I can break it up with some music. Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C. Paul Chaperas on bass, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. The songs we use in this episode are instrumental versions of songs they wrote for their latest album, Everything is Normal. You can find where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. Walter Olson, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
Last week was quite the week at the Supreme Court, several major decisions. Where do you want to start?
The biggest one is universal injunction. It was framed in the media sometimes as a case about birthright citizenship, but it wasn't really. They didn't decide that issue. Most people I know, including me, believe that when they eventually get around to deciding that, the Trump administration will lose. But in the meantime, they decided something that is of tremendous practical importance as well as theoretical. When a court issues an order, in this case against the government, although it could possibly be against other defendants, do they tell it to stop violating the rights of the person who sued, or can they issue a broader order saying stop violating anyone's rights or stop violating the Constitution if it's the government? A century or more, courts have been handing down decisions that looked very much like universal injunctions, and no one objected to the Supreme Court, wait a minute, they're going too far. Courts have for a very long time had some recognized power to fix the problem generally of a government behaving unconstitutionally. And the 2 examples that I give, in the Pierce versus Society of Sisters case, which is exactly 100 years, that was the one that struck down an Oregon law which had banned private schools. What the Oregon District Court did, a federal court, was they didn't just say you have to allow the particular private schools who sued to operate. You have to let all the private schools operate. Much the same thing in West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett, which is the flag salute Pledge of Allegiance case taught in every First Amendment course, where the students were Jehovah's Witnesses, and it was against their religious scruples to do those two things. And the court, reversing what had been the rule before then, said, no, under the Constitution, they have a right to not participate in those things, and you can't expel them. And again, the question is, should the federal court in that case have said, reinstate these two kids and we're going to stop there, or should they have done what they did do, which is to say, from now on, you may not expel anyone for not saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Those are cases from the 1920s and the 1940s. This has not been particularly controversial until recent years, when judges have been using this a lot more. Now, you can ask why. It's very much used against Biden, and ironically, Stephen Miller, who is now applauding the new thing, was at the forefront of filing cases, successfully obtaining universal injunctions against Biden, and crowed like a rooster every time he did. To be absolutely fair, we should concede that there are good arguments that it can go too far often, that it can decide some questions too soon, that it can sweep in some things that are not exactly alike, and that the higher courts sometimes, in fact, do reverse them.
I'm imagining the Obamacare mandate question that had an injunction.
Pretty much all of the conservative huge victories striking down new government programs have involved an injunction somewhere along the line. Now, you can say that they would have won many of these cases anyway, but won them perhaps a little more slowly. One piece here that we need to fill in is that in normal times, with normal administration, if you lose the narrower injunction, say, the Jehovah's Witnesses students win, then you get the message, particularly if there's a second and a third district court that come to the same conclusion. At that point, you say, we better stop this policy. 2 or 3 courts have separately ruled against us. The Trump administration, I need hardly say, is not behaving like normal administrations of both parties. The Trump administration takes the view that you can lose 4 cases in a row, as on birthright citizenship. And who cares? It only applies in those 4 particular judicial districts.
At least in the last 100 years, the question of injunction has been tied in some respect to the substantive issue. I understand that birthright citizenship is not what they ruled on, but there is a judgment on the part of justices that there is a good substantial claim that the final decision is going to go this way or that, and you're providing an injunction in that direction.
There's a multi-part test, of which increasingly the most important one is the case going to win when we hear all of the evidence? And if it's not likely to win, then that ends the thing. You don't get the preliminary injunction. And they look at a couple of other things. They look at the hardships, because sometimes, even if the plaintiff is going to win, there's a terrible hardship on the defendant in having a preliminary injunction, and you have to take that into account. And Sotomayor was blistering on this. She said, there is not irreparable damage to the federal government when you keep them from doing something unconstitutional. None of these factors operated in favor of the Trump administration, which made this such an incredibly bad case to announce this tremendously sweeping rule.
How do you think that rule now applies to state and local governments?
It applies to them in 2 ways, as defendants and as plaintiffs. As defendants, it means that states are freed up somewhat. It is harder to get them to behave when they are violating the law, just as it's harder to get the federal government to behave. On the other hand, states also appear in court increasingly these days as plaintiffs, like they will sue the Trump administration and ask for injunctions. And in that role, they wind up in a new and special position, because in their attempts to see whether there are ways around this week's decision that will save some of the perceived good things that could be done with universal injunctions. Well, one of the main ways around is if a state is the plaintiff and they are saying, we have to maintain state programs which keep track of whether everyone is entitled to benefits or not. And so we need to know comprehensively who is a citizen in our state and who is not. Therefore, we deserve an injunction which applies to all people in the state of Washington or whatever who are potentially going to lose their citizenship. Well, that's a pretty good case, actually. The states have something genuinely to lose. A lot of people think that you can get back some of the force of the broad injunctions by making sure that it's states doing the suing.
I am really concerned, though, at the local level, if this really means that you cannot get a local government or a police department to stop harassing people, that is just disastrous to me.
The big flowering of public interest injunctions started in the 50s and 60s against states and cities, and it would be runaway police departments, it would be prison systems, it would be mental health systems, and very sweeping injunctions were ordered in which courts second-guessed a lot of different things. Now, those have gone into a certain amount of disrepute, certainly among the more conservative justices, but the idea that with a mental hospital, for example, rather than being able to say, the whole structure of what you are doing in putting people in an institution has to stop, it's just a long series of you must release this person because they've spent 3 years suing, and then you must release this other person who spent 4 years suing. Where would it go if it had to be done that way?
So does that then encourage class action suits?
Yes, using states as plaintiffs is path number one. Doing class actions, which the Supreme Court considered itself in its opinion, is number two. Likely to take more time. You've got a whole phase or multiple phases in which you determine whether class treatment is appropriate, which you're going to have to go through. So there are going to be new problems, and Justice Alito was waiting there in his concurrence, just like a spider, saying, we know what you're trying to do. Some of you are going to bring class actions and try to recreate the universal injunction. And so long as I'm here, we're not going to let that happen. Many battles ahead on this. One thing that's worth pointing out is that this was not a constitutional decision. This was based on the power given to the courts by federal statutes passed by Congress, which means that a new Congress at some point could largely reverse this.
What is truly interesting as well is that the other decision that actually is a Montgomery County-based decision in Mahmood versus Taylor, which is about the LGBTQ books in the school system and the ability of parents to opt their children out. They did offer injunction to the entire CBS.
Well, and the Supreme Court's pronouncement could hardly have been broader, speaking on, first they constitutionalized it. They minted a new right that supposedly is going to be usable by all religious families against all, not only creating the right to opt out, but also, and I think in many ways more burdensome to the schools, the right to be notified of material about which they might have wanted to opt out. Accepting an opt-out request once it comes in is the easy part. You tell the teacher to do an alternate lesson. On the other hand, taking a 250-page novel from the 19th century and deciding whether it's going to violate anyone's religious sensibilities, does it ever mention anyone's religion? Does it mention issues like the slaughter and eating of animals, to which some people have legitimate religious objections? Does it mention war or glorify war, which the peace churches, and right here in Western Maryland, it's been historically a very important sector for the Brethren, Mennonites, Quakers. So you're going to read that 19th century novel with that in mind and necessarily catch everything, or you violated someone's constitutional rights? I don't see it. I think in response to what was a genuine grievance, and if I were on the Montgomery County School Board, I would have left the opt-out intact. I think that that's a good way, of some ways the most diverse school system in the whole country, to survive serious differences between parents and what they want. But is the remedy going to be completely impractical and open up new constitutional problems about whether or not free exercise is being applied impartially and evenly to less popular religious beliefs, just as it is to more popular religious beliefs?
Who is going to determine free exercise? I mean, the potential that free exercise is violated is now in the hands of teachers.
An enormous responsibility has been placed on school administrators, including teachers, but the ones who actually are going to have to answer the things in court are not typically the teachers. It is the higher-ups.
But you can imagine there is no administrator that is reading every book taught in class. Only the teacher does that. And so now teachers is responsible for letting the administrator know.
We can only speculate when we think about what the Supreme Court thinks ought to be done in order to prevent violation of constitutional rights. One of them is probably the idea that pops up in a lot of conservative writing about curriculum, which is that all curriculum ought to be publicly posted in a place where parents can get at it before the class meets. But it's super burdensome, and it ties teachers' hands. If they discover deliver something that would make good curriculum, that just was, a poem that they saw the day before, they can't bring it in. They can't be very newsy because that can't be posted a week before on a website. It ties the hands of good educators in order to create a cold formalist right, which I even agree with kind of in principle, but I just don't think can be put into practice in the way that some of these folks think. So I want to talk also about, as far as I can see, this is the most substantively anti-gay decision, the only one that I would necessarily tag as substantively anti-gay since the old days when they were upholding sodomy laws. The situation in Montgomery County, as described by the court, could have resulted in some sort of constitutional right not to have your kids indoctrinated. Alito really is quite opinionated on this stuff, but he sets it out so that you all know that a bunch of liberals in Montgomery County were trying to go to war with the religious values of the parents, and they saw themselves as countering that as something that was socially progressive to combat the views that kids might be bringing in from household instruction. That would be a stronger case that there is a free exercise problem. And then by the time you get to remedies, it is simply exposure to pro-gay material, regardless of what the motivation might have been for bringing it in, that becomes unconstitutional without the various, big difference between intentionally violating someone's religious sensibilities and just happening to have gay stuff. We now have, in a Supreme Court opinion, the idea that whatever the intention, that parading the existence of a gay marriage ceremony in front of small kids may interfere with their religious upbringing and religious formation. Now, why wouldn't this logic extend to restrictions on the public square, onto what could be on the internet, in the media? These are, in fact, we know, all subjects that some social conservatives do want to regulate on that very basis.
Because it is so burdensome, they are trying to have teachers and schools self-censor.
I don't have any doubt that that's the practical effect. Depending on where you are and what state you're in, they may walk on eggshells about evolution. They may walk on eggshells on sex education. This is what the school's democratic process produces in most of the country. Most parents approve of it walking on eggshells. I am not one that believes that everyone should be required to attend public school and then there should not be any democratic input as to what is taught. To me, it may be the least bad compromise between different things. This, it seems to me, is beyond doing that. Since the decisions of the 60s, we just haven't had to see certain types of favoritism for some religions, certain types of burdens on the schools. And make no mistake, they have invented a new constitutional right. My question, as someone who came up through conservative law, is always, okay, sounds good. What happens when people try to mass produce it? Mass production of religious opt-out rights can be used to harass a school system that has, in fact, been using perfectly acceptable sorts of things. And we've gone through this controversy in Frederick County where the county was convulsed by these demands to take stuff out of the schools. And then a citizens panel, including people from both sides, went through and they found like 2 or 3 books that should be put in higher grades. And that was about where the consensus was. But in the meantime, people had made their point by putting the school system through all sorts of grief. We've managed to avoid elevation of traditional Christian orthodoxy above other things, several decades of Supreme Court. And I just question whether that's going to last now. We have a Supreme Court that, in my view, is not in the right frame of mind of trying to dampen cultural wars. It is more willing to enlist on one of the sides.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with my guest, legal scholar Walter Olson. Let's talk a little bit about the Trump administration's case against the Maryland Federal District Court judges that were filed against them personally.
Very irregular for them to proceed in that way and by suing the judges personally. My first reaction was, if you think that a court has done something wrong, your remedy is to appeal. The Fourth Circuit is right there. And to back up, this year there has been a flood of deportation or alien removal cases in which the federal government is trying to act very, very quickly. As everyone knows, there have been instances in which there is real question of whether they've committed contempt of court or violated the removed person's rights in other ways. Courts have been hit by a large volume of these cases. And Around the country, federal courts have local rules for what to do. It's a very fast-moving case, and they might try to deport before the judge has a chance to rule. The District of Maryland, which is the federal district that includes all federal cases filed in Maryland, adopted a court-wide rule saying everyone's going to be put in the same pot on this, which is the federal government can't deport until 4 p.m. of a following business day. Sometimes described as a one-day delay and sometimes as a two-day delay. Now you know why there's that difference. The federal government's counter to that, as far as why they think it's improper, is that it would have been okay for you to do this one by one on motion by the lawyers, but having a court rule about it ties our hands with an injunction that is broader than it would have had to be. So you see the echo of what the Supreme Court was picking up on with universal injunctions. It actually is an echo. It's a version of the same issue. Their other argument is that you adopted it without proper notice. Court rules are supposed to be put out with a certain amount of notice to litigants that they can all prepare to litigate under the new rule. And they said that you cut corners and didn't adopt it right. In both cases, why not go to their bosses, namely the Fourth Circuit, and say, District of Maryland has adopted rules that we believe improperly tie our hands. If they had done that, this would be a page 27 story. The most obvious thing about suing the judges individually is that you make them feel personally nervous. Are they going to have to hire lawyers themselves? Do they face liability themselves? Will they get reimbursed? Gee, who would reimburse me? Oh, wait a minute, the federal court system. Is there some way that they can cut off the funding for reimbursing us in the next budget bill? Perhaps judicial immunity goes too far, but perhaps it's also an important part of the system that we have judicial immunity. And then what they do, they demand immediately that all of the judges they are suing recuse themselves, because after all, they're defendants, so how can they hear the case? And then they say, oh yes, it gets worse. And then the Fourth Circuit, which should take over management of the case. Notice that they don't say the Fourth Circuit should just issue a ruling. The Fourth Circuit is not a court that the Trump administration necessarily expects to do well with. Remember that it was the Fourth Circuit with Harvey Wilkinson, a very well-known conservative judge from the Reagan era, absolutely blistering them on due process. So if that's what the conservatives on the Fourth Circuit are giving them, and actually what the liberals, because so they don't want the Fourth Circuit immediately to go to the substance of their complaint. So what they want the Fourth Circuit to do is to randomly pick a judge in a district from one of the other states in the circuit. Now, the Fourth Circuit includes Maryland, of course. It also includes Virginia, which is not too different from Maryland. It includes North Carolina, South Carolina, and West Virginia. Well, guess what? If the Fourth Circuit accepts their advice to pick a judge randomly, Trump might hit the jackpot and get West Virginia or South Carolina. He might get North Carolina and probably have a considerably less liberal environment with whatever the random judge is there. Even Virginia is going to be a lot more likely to give him a conservative federal district judge.
All of these cases seem to have some novelty to them, their arguments and how they proceed. There is somebody or some group of people that has a really, really solid basis in law to make these kinds of things happen. Do you have a sense of who these are, how they're operating? What is going on?
This time around, they're using smart people. Maybe it was David Farmer, maybe he was just repeating someone else. I said that this is like the Jurassic Park sequel in which the dinosaurs have learned how to operate the doorknob.
Is this something sort of going wrong with the legal profession as well? That there are people that now think that this is okay?
In the first Trump term, they were not getting most of the talent to come along and help them. The people who were pretty talented, who would be willing to come along and help them, like Bill Barr, for example, the Attorney General. First, he had enough scruples that, at a bunch of different forks in the road, Barr refused to do the wrong thing. I'm not going to say all of them, but a bunch of younger people were coming up. Some of them at that point, because it was 5 or 10 years ago, weren't in a position to be considered for senior legal jobs. Institutions began to develop, like America First Legal, Stephen Miller's, which launched MAGA-style litigation in the Biden administration. And they developed a bench. They developed a talent pool of people who were capable of stepping into senior federal positions. And, I'm not one who dwells endlessly on Project 2025 as the skeleton key to understanding everything, but it was symbolic of the fact that there was a big effort with the involvement of people like Russell Vought to think out ahead of time the issues that they would be facing rather than think through them on the job. That pre-thinking has been very effective. And in a way, that's an example of the broader observation that the changes that administrations make tend to have been hashed out in intellectual discussions during the 4 or 5 or 10 years before they take office.
In the past, people would not actually allow themselves to be co-opted, but now they are willingly doing this.
Trump, too, is different. One piece of that is that the environment of incentives and expectations for people in the law have changed. It used to be that some of these arguments being made right now every day by the Justice Department lawyers, would cause you to fall so in the estimation of your peers that you could never expect to be appointed to a judgeship if you had gone to court and argued that. And this peer pressure, which has always been critical to a healthy legal profession, it includes the respect of your adversaries, the respect of your opposing lawyers, respect of your allied lawyers. It includes very much the respect of judges who, and one of the questions that I have is, are judges going to continue to screen in their clerkships against this type of personality? The crop of people who have been trained, been reading Adrian Vermeule, the Harvard religious law theorist, who have been trained under some of the other leading lights, they are now out of law, past their first credential or two, and ready for action.
So interesting that the intellectual fountainhead of the new religious movement is at Harvard, which is under attack.
Every anti-elite movement turns out to, once you check its genealogy, right back into those elites.
Which is a perfect segue to Zohran Mamdani.
If you're looking for elite backgrounds, having a mom who is, a much awarded, much admired filmmaker, is a pretty good start for that. On behalf of the socialists of New York, and I seldom get to speak for them, but people seldom seem to realize that both David Dinkins and Bill de Blasio, I believe, were associated with the Democratic Socialists of America. This is not new, folks. What's new? What's new, is that you've got someone who talks in a completely different way and that you want to watch on television.
So what can we learn about ranked choice voting, your other favorite hobby horse?
Before the primary, there was this booming conservative literature that was all ready to blame ranked choice voting for Mamdani beating Cuomo on the grounds that he would pick up more of the second choice and third choices of the other candidates. Well, we know, in fact, that didn't happen and wasn't needed. They are so suspicious that it is a George Soros plot. As far as I know, George Soros has never done anything on ranked choice voting. And they are so concerned that somehow or other it will be helpful to the left. Now, those who actually have lived in cities with ranked choice voting are aware that that's not mostly how it's worked out. In the various big cities out west that have had it for some years, like San Francisco, the moderates have learned how to campaign with ranked choice voting in order to help the moderates pick up each other's second choice votes. I always like to say in Montgomery County that there's a good chance that one of the moderate Democrats would be county executive instead of Mark Ulrich if you had been allowed to use ranked choice voting. And the question arises, and it needs to be addressed fairly, of since ranked choice voting, quote, didn't make a difference in the final winner of the primary, was it all a lot of fuss over nothing? And my response to that is, first, we've known from all of the studies that it seldom actually changes the outcome as far as putting a second placer into first place after the rounds go by. That only happens occasionally. It's not the biggest effect. When it does happen, there's usually some good reason, such as the majority being split.
So maybe explain what the promise of ranked choice voting is before you say the next part.
Okay. The ranked choice voting You have the election and everyone can pick in New York, their first 5 choices by rank, favorite, second favorite, and on down. You then begin eliminating candidates from the bottom, those who get 1% of the vote or whatever, and reallocate their votes to whatever their second choice was, provided that second choice has not been eliminated or otherwise go down the list of 5. If you have the chance to see Mamdani's South Asian video, he uses 5 transparent cups of lassi. The cup of lassi that got least lassi poured into it is eliminated, and it is poured, portions of it are poured into the other 4 cups, depending on who those people voted for. And it continues until the final round when the third cup of lassi is redistributed and you see which cup of lassi wound up higher. And then he drinks the lassi. So this is actually just about the best demonstration of ranked choice voting. So after enough rounds of redistribution, someone has 50% plus 1, and it's over then. So the idea is if you have an electorate in one of 2 situations, which is it can be the badly split situation, so familiar in Montgomery County Democratic primaries, in which someone has 31% and someone has 29% and someone has 23%. You have a real chance of figuring out more accurately what the public's real sentiments are and not necessarily elevating someone who may be disliked by the people who didn't vote for him.
If ranked choice voting produces the same results as first past the post, which is the traditional way we vote, then how does that happen?
Every so often, you will find that the original first place finisher is outdistanced, and then you've identified one of the cases that is an ideal use case for ranked choice voting, which is where first past the post would have returned the wrong candidate as far as true popularity. So even if it only happens 1 in every 15 times, it's good that it happens then. The second thing that it does is it changes how people campaign and even who runs for office in interesting ways. You saw this very much in New York City when Eric Adams was elected. You saw deliberate coalitions form between candidates. You saw candidates appeal to each other's bases, saying, I know I'm not your first choice, I'd like to be your second choice. In New York politics, where a lot of it is ethnic and you're aiming at attracting particular ethnic groups, this is kind of powerful because you may realize that you don't have the East Asians locked up necessarily. They may have their own candidate, Andrew Yang or whoever, who is particularly popular. But Andrew Yang's not going to make it to the final round. So under first past the post, you just ignore them. Under ranked choice voting, you spend time in those communities, maybe try to get Andrew Yang on the same podium talking about how you're actually pretty good, and might make a good second choice. So it changes campaigning, it changes outreach, more people get campaigned to, and it rewards a certain type of personality. In Utah, a woman I know got elected twice to office, first under first past the post, second time under ranked choice voting. She said that the mode of campaigning was totally different. Under first past the post, we could not resist saying the zingers that we knew were going to help destroy the reputation of one of our near competitors. And they made people dislike us too, but it was so tempting to just, kneecap them. Second time we campaigned, a lot of the same people, we talked about the issues because we didn't want to get someone else's camp of followers, insanely mad at us by what we had said about their candidate. So it was all more positive. It was all more issue-oriented. So, people talk about how Mamdani had this campaign where he, kept coming back to his issues of affordability, of this and that. You may agree or disagree with his solutions. I tend to disagree. But nonetheless, that's how we're supposed to want people to campaign. Now, who didn't do that? Well, guess who? Andrew Cuomo didn't do that. Same as Sarah Palin didn't do that. Even though some of Cuomo's backers tried to engage in ranked choice arguments, the New York Times obviously was one. But Cuomo himself tried to be above it all. And now, we've got 2 good data points in Alaska and New York as to what voters think when you do that.
Mamdani had cross-endorsed with Brad Lander. How did you think that worked?
A lot of New Yorkers believed that it made some difference. Lander was a trusted validator, as I guess they say in the advertising business. That is, there were Jewish voters who had doubts about whether it was okay to vote for Mamdani, and Lander, as the highest-ranking Jewish citywide elected official, could reassure them on that. There were people who had serious doubts as to whether or not Mamdani's experience was too sparse, being only a legislator for only 2 terms, to handle the administrative responsibilities. Well, here you have Brad Lander, who had been in the thick of administrative responsibilities. You can't get away from those if you're comptroller, saying, yes, I believe that managerially, he is very much up to snuff.
Walter Olson, thank you as always.
Oh, glad to be on.
That's legal scholar, ranked choice voting advocate, and Frederick, Maryland resident, Walter Olson. That's all for this episode. Be sure to check out our feature interview series that come out Friday mornings. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C. Paul Chaperas on bass, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synthesizers and percussion. The songs we use in this episode are instrumental versions of songs they wrote for their latest album, Everything is Normal. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.